Welcome. Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you if you're joining us on Facebook Live or if you've registered and are with us on our webinar. We're glad you're here. It's a really exciting day. We're right in the midst of the launch of this important and really significant new book by Charlie Camosy. I've got my copy, just arrived, Losing Our Dignity. And this book is now really right in the midst of our launch of it. And so we're excited to have friends of Charlie's, people that know Charlie. Maybe you've read Charlie's books in the past, or maybe you're just new and really were struck by the topic. But whatever has brought you here, we're glad you're here. We're going to have you, we're planning to just be here for about 40 minutes, just as a chance to hear from Charlie directly, learn some about this new project, and really connect you to the mission of the book, which is a really important mission. We were just talking before we started that just even some of the headlines today really relate directly to some of the themes of the book. So we're excited to be able to talk about it together today. If you have questions, we're asking you to ask your questions on social media. We'll be keeping an eye on social media using the hashtag Restore Dignity. Restore Dignity. And I'll put that, we'll just encourage you to ask your questions using that hashtag. Also, if you have any comments or feedback, you can use the Q&A box if you're watching us on the webinar, on the Zoom space. But for now, I just want to turn things over to Charlie and just thank him for working with New City Press for this new book. And Charlie, there's a real urgency to the book. And we're wondering, as we get started, what kind of brought you to this new project, and what are you hoping to achieve with this new book? Oh, you're on mute.
First, let me just thank everyone for showing up in the middle of the day. I appreciate that, or at least in the middle of the day over here. On the West Coast, even more. It's morning over by you guys in California, right? So thank you. A lot of people on this call who mean a great deal to me. So thank you for coming. You know, in some ways, I've been trying to tell the story of this book for some time now. The loss of fundamental human equality is something that secularized medicine has been driving for decades, and I've written about for 13 years in some ways. But two things really kind of pushed me to write this particular book with a kind of urgency. You know, I've discussed brain death before, I've discussed abortion before, so-called persistent vegetative state before, and that's a major part of the story I tell in the book. But the final two chapters focus on, well, the second to last chapter is on Alfie Evans, the toddler that had neurodegenerative disease that was basically euthanized by omission by the United Kingdom recently. And that, many of you probably remember that story. And then in looking at both before and during the pandemic, how we treat human beings who have some kind of dementia, especially later stage dementia. When I saw that it was both our toddlers and our elders, if they're disabled, neuroatypical human beings, that we kind of discard them and throw them away. My book that I wrote for New City Press as well, right before this one, was called Resisting Throwaway Culture. When I saw resisting throwaway culture targeting both toddlers and elders, I thought, boy, you know, we're really headed to something new and disturbing here that requires a kind of urgent all hands on deck approach.
You know, and I think that we this might be a good moment just kind of early on to share the video trailer that we've done about the book, but really zeroing in right where you were going there in terms of the issue of dementia and some of the impacts that we began to see over this last year plus during the pandemic. So I think we'll go ahead and show that now.
I know, it's the last thing you want to think about. But consider the COVID-19 pandemic with me for a moment. I'd invite you to think not about the virus, but about what it has exposed. There's something going on and it needs to be sorted out. That's a quote from Robert Anderson, Chief of Mortality Statistics at the CDC. Our unspoken horror story in this country is how we treat people in nursing homes, especially those suffering from dementia. Worldwide, more than 50 million people are living with dementia. And that number will double every 20 years. Nurses are abandoning the profession, leaving nursing homes understaffed. People can make better money at Walmart than they can by caring for our most vulnerable. This is on track to get worse and spiral into a crisis that touches everyone and damages everything. Society can therefore choose one of three paths. First, we can slouch towards robot care, which isn't real care because it isn't human. Second, we could slide into euthanasia, solving a social problem by killing those who need care. The third option is to move with urgency to restore human dignity. A challenging path, but one with clear social and moral benefits, and one with a strong pre-existing foundation. This is what my new book is about. Grappling with a spiraling crisis before it consumes us, asking hard questions, and finding the right way forward.
Charlie, in the video, there's a quote there that you highlight from the CDC, from the director of the CDC. And as we were getting ready for this webinar, we invited people to ask questions as they signed up. And one of the questions I think really ties to that quote. One of the registrants was saying, in his experience, he hasn't seen abandonment of dementia patients. And so he's really asking, what level is this really occurring? I'm wondering if you could maybe flesh out a little bit, because that is a key part of the book. If you could flesh out some of that for us, particularly as it relates to that CDC quote.
Yeah, one of the pernicious aspects of throwaway culture, of course, is that it often hides and distorts what's actually going on, so we don't have to think about it too much. This is a classic example. I wish I had a chapter in Resisting Throwaway Culture on this, but it's in this book. Let me share my screen if I can for a moment to actually highlight the Politico article that quoted Robert Anderson. So this is the article that I was referring to. This is the quote. There's something going on. It needs to be sorted out. What was found by this Politico investigation is that about 20% more people with dementia died the summer of during the pandemic as opposed to the summer before. And that's not of COVID-19 related stuff. That's just deaths from the dementia itself and Alzheimer's in particular. You can see some of the graphs here showing the rise. This is compared to heart disease and respiratory disease, but actually saw some significant lowering here, at least with that. So one way to talk about it is the way the pandemic kind of revealed what was going on. And you could say, well, that's just during the pandemic, I suppose. But in my research for this book, I found out that's absolutely not the case. One person I talked to, Paula Teleferio, as part of my research, works on as a consultant for aging and dementia issues in Ohio. And I asked her about this and whether, dementia residents and patients were being treated poorly. She responded, yes, 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 with exclamation points. They are often over-medicated and left to sit in a chair and wait for meals or showers. She noted that those with money, of course, have better outcomes than those without. But those without money are often, these are her words, quote, warehoused in bad facilities that do little to meet any needs other than the most basic, end quote. And the book, of course, ties all this together in a story. And what I found so interesting in my research on PVS patients, I focus in particular on Dr. Finn's book, Dr. Joseph Finn's book, Rights Come to Mind, where he talks about, well, he does qualitative research on how PVS patients are treated. And it was interesting. There was this one guy he interviewed who said, there's a floor for, quote, everybody who had no opportunity or no prospect of ever being very alive. Alzheimer's patients, people who were in PVS. So they had this horrible second floor. If you went up there, it was filthy, the staff was bad, end quote. And back even in 2018, and I cite this as well in the book, Human Rights Watch was just all over this over-medicating people with dementia. Often it's with antipsychotic drugs, just to keep them docile and generally in need of less care. So this is, the pandemic revealed sort of what's going on in a way, and exacerbated, obviously. But this is something that is really, really apparent. Even if you can get beyond throwaway culture's ability to hide it from us, it takes 2 seconds to really see that this is a really difficult situation.
So Charlie, one of the reasons that we wanted to do this launch kind of early in the month was because there has been a real, sense for you as you've been preparing the book, that there's a real mission to this book, that there's kind of an urgency around this growing crisis, particularly around dementia care, and a real significant part of the book. And I think even Church Life Journal excerpted from this part last week, in the excerpt of the book they ran, is really your call to religious communities to really, really be alerted and engaging this issue now as this crisis is developing. And so I thought we could take a moment to let people know, because we really do want to encourage people to connect. We know a lot of you really appreciate the work that Charlie's doing and committed to these issues. We wanted to alert you to something we're doing related to the mission of the book. I'll just share my screen briefly to pull it up for you. We will be doing at the end of this month, on July 26th, a webinar really directly flowing from some of the key elements of the book, Dignity and Dementia, mapping the church's response to the coming crisis. So we're going to be bringing together a number of key people to join with Charlie. Bishop Van, Catherine Lopez is going to be moderating, the Director of Communications at Little Sisters of the Poor, and Aaron Junkins, who's really at the forefront of working on some of these issues. So we're going to be having a gathering to really help the church think through, help Christian communities and other communities of faith begin to think through responses to this crisis. So we just wanted to mention that. I'll put into the chat box for people that this is one of the ways that you can really support the mission of the book and learn more about the mission of this book at this time. Will be happening this webinar. Do you want to add anything to that, Charlie?
I do. So one of the, maybe it shouldn't have been surprising, but one of the surprising things for me is how this has gone beyond kind of a Christian or Catholic level of interest. I've had some really interesting conversations with aspects of the Jewish community here in New Jersey, where I live, and in New York, where I work, who are very interested in this as well. It's an interesting story. I got to tell this part of the book's story. The reason why New Jersey and New York allow for religious freedom for families who have brain dead individuals in their family to continue to care for them, to not say that a living human being that can gestate a child or fight off a disease is dead, is because they fought for it and they got it. And so they're the only two states in the union actually that have religious freedom for families that want to care for their loved ones who have a catastrophic brain injury like that. So they're already attuned to this serious problem and are ahead of the curve in many ways. And they're also, at least the communities I'm in contact with, they're deeply, deeply rooted communities where the families and extended families are all around to help care for each other, especially their elders when they get into this context. But they can see the writing on the wall that the culture is moving in a very different direction. And so that was a long way of saying it's not, even though that webinar is focused, I think, on the church's kind of response, there's really an important opening for dialogue with others, especially, fellow people of the book who share the theological view that what makes us all equal and fundamentally valuable is that we're all created in the image and likeness of God.
Mm. Yeah, that's a really important section of the book is where you talk about building bridges of dialogue out on this issue. And so it's encouraging to hear that that's already beginning to happen for you as the word of the book begins to go out. So that's one of the ways that we wanted to share with you all that you can connect to the mission of the book. We did just want to take a couple minutes to spell out a few other ways that you can be a part of really helping us with the launch of this book as we get going this month. One way is we're encouraging people, if you buy, if you have an Amazon account, we are encouraging people to buy the book via Amazon. The reason that we're doing that is because this book, the more that we kind of have a launch on Amazon, it really heightens people to be able to it'll show up in searches more readily. It'll show up on rankings early on, and it will really be an important way on that key buyer site, seller site, for people to learn about the book. So we encourage you to buy the book there if you have an account. That would be really, really helpful to the mission of the book. Of course, we also have it in the email that we'll send out following it. Of course, we have the book at our website, and it's available in a number of different ways. But for us, we just wanted to let you know that for us, the sense of the mission of the book would be best served if you buy your copies early on. We'd encourage you to buy them soon. They're actually, in some parts of the country, when the people are at the Amazon site, it looks like it's even already available. So within this week, it's going to be shipping by July 15th at the latest from Amazon. We would also encourage you to write reviews for the book on Amazon. Even if you don't buy the book there, you can review the book there if you have an Amazon account. And that is also a really, really critical way to help the book and its visibility for people to know about it. If there's reviews, it really pushes it up on the search engines on Amazon. And that's been very, very helpful with Charlie's other books, including Resisting Throwaway Culture. So we thank you for those of you that have written reviews before, and we'd ask you again to write a review on Amazon. Also, when you get the book, when the book arrives, as I just showed it up to you, we'd encourage you to do something similar when you get the book. If you could take a picture of the book, tag Charlie on social media, tag New City Press on social media, and share that you've gotten the book. It's a really great way to share word of mouth, to spread it around, is to take a picture and share that on social media. And again, using the hashtag Restore Dignity would also be a real helpful way to help build awareness for this book and for the mission of the book. I already mentioned the webinar, the July 26th webinar. There's also a nice one to share, on your social media, to invite people to come. We will send that link again in the follow-up email. Also, I know a number of you that signed up that are here today. You might be a writer, you might do reviews, you might be in a place to invite Charlie to come to speak or to do an interview. We just encourage you to reach out directly to Charlie. He'd be happy to interact with you. If you have questions about the topic of the book and we're not able to get to all of them today, we'd encourage you to email him directly. But there's a lot of ways that you can really be a part of helping with the launch of this book and the mission of the book. And we just want to thank you for anything that you can do to do that. I think Charlie just put into the box for you the video that we just showed as well. There's a link to that that's easy to share, and I think does a really good job of capturing some of the key elements of the book. So that was our moment to really try to pull you on and give you some direct ways that you can help. And feel free if you have any questions or comments about that, we'll try to answer them as well. But Charlie, I wanted to come back to another question that we had from someone who had registered. And it's kind of related to the subtitle of the book, How Secularized Medicine is Undermining Fundamental Human Quality. This registrant asked, she said, you rightly point out that the secular is not the neutral space it sometimes imagines itself to be, but that religious and secular claims should be allowed to dialogue on equal footing. But especially in medicine, this runs completely counter to most people's assumptions. There's a lot of people's assumptions when they look at medicine. They do tend to view it as just this completely secular, neutral space. Can you just explore that question and that challenge of bringing this topic into the discussion, your perspective? Oh, you're on mute.
Twice in the same one. Thank you for that question, Jordan. Jordan is flying high as a bioethicist herself, and will soon be, already is part of these conversations at a very high level, and doing great research and on her way. So thanks for being a part of this, Jordan. So especially in just kind of everyday circles that don't think about this stuff all day long, we do think of medicine as this kind of neutral place, don't we? That kind of like, well, you just have the science and the technical skill, and you just kind of do it, right? You get trained in a technical way and you just do it. But again, it doesn't take too long to think about the most important things we debate about in healthcare and medicine, to say that, well, that's not right? I mean, you can study all the technical stuff you want. You can study all the science you want. You're not going to come to an answer, say, about what public policy should be about abortion and euthanasia, for instance, or just distribution of limited medical resources, or how to balance, the profession of healthcare and its own kind of ends-based approach versus patient autonomy and a patient's desire to have what they want from their providers. And just there's a million more topics you could go into, and you'd say, well, it's important to get the neutral facts and the neutral technical skill right about that stuff, but it really goes to a fundamental question of value, right? Beyond technical skill or scientific knowledge. It gets to a question of values. And fundamental values, which is what's at the heart of the book, right? A fundamental value about who we all are, right? Are we just consumers, producers, rational people who think a lot or something? Is that what makes us we? Or is the we something more fundamental about our natures, right? Our kind of, our natures which reflect the image and likeness of God, as I mentioned before. That again is something that is so at the heart of so many questions in medicine, but can't be answered in a medical textbook, isn't answered, and it may be ridiculous to think of it as being answered in a medical textbook. And I cite in the book this amazing husband and wife team at Harvard Medical School, Michael and Tracy Balboni, who wrote an amazing book called Hostility to Hospitality, I believe is the title of it. And they talk about chief loves. They use this language, chief loves, in the book, which I love. As a way of saying, well, we all have chief loves, or in other contexts, we have first principles. We all have first principles, or sources of ultimate concern. Some folks like to talk about. And these are the values and places where we stand, which orient us and ground us and give us a vision for looking at these topics at all. And we all have one. There's no view from nowhere. We all have a particular vision through which we see these things. And that's a key part of the book, because what I'm arguing is, yes, we need religious communities to marshal themselves and respond to this, but we also need to engage with a largely secular institution or set of institutions in healthcare. And we ought to demand an equal seat at the table with others who who are at the table and deserve their seat at the table as well. And but too often, because of this attitude that, well, this is a neutral space, this is an objective space, there's no room for this kind of thing. No, these are essential questions and topics to consider if we're going to address these sets of issues. And so if we're going to dialogue, and we desperately need to dialogue with secular institutions on these questions, it ought to be with this sense that there is no view from nowhere, there is no neutral ground. We all bring our chief loves, first principles, or sources of ultimate concern to bear, whether we're secular or religious.
Thank you. And I think I saw somebody may have raised their hand. If they want to just put their comment into the chat box, we'd be happy to respond. Or I'm sorry, into the chat box or the Q&A box. We'd be happy to respond to whatever you have for us there. Charlie, one of the things as I was reading the book, your book a couple years ago, Resisting Throwaway Culture, was kind of building this consistent ethic of life vision. And one of the things that was kind of, as we've been reading this book, it's almost like what you're really alerting us to is there's kind of another consistent ethic that seems to be forming around issues, where you're kind of looking at a number of different issues in the book, but you're seeing something disturbingly consistent underneath it. And then you're seeing that same ethic now coming towards this issue of dementia. Could you unpack that piece of what you're doing in this book for us a little bit?
Yeah. So on one level, it is a consistent vision or lens that I'm looking at it, in the sense that, as I've already mentioned, of course, if we look at rationality, self-awareness, capacity for consumption or production, human beings are not all equal. It's just anybody that takes 2 seconds to look at that can realize that. And that we need some account of a nature or kind, I would say, that unites us all in a way that suggests something that I think we intuitively know, which is we are all equal regardless of those things. But there's another way in which I try to have a consistent lens throughout the book that might be of interest here to mention here, which is often when those get kicked out or thrown away from the community of the equal, the fundamentally equal, it often is related to an issue of scarce resources. So back to the brain death thing, one of the things that every kind of intro to bioethics student should know, at least, about the development of brain death, is that it came about not because a group of people were convinced by arguments that someone that could gestate a child or fight off an infection was really dead. It came about because the invention of the ventilator and the invention of organ transplants came about in a similar kind of generation. And people said, well, we need to use, some people said, we need to use these people's organs to save the lives of others who could, lead more full lives. And so, as my book points out, and I'm not the first one to point this out, but what happened was that there was something called this Harvard Brain Death Commission, which said in earlier drafts of their report, hey, we basically need to redefine death in order to have more of this scarce resource, organs. And of course, I'm totally supportive of organ donation. I think people should. I'm an organ donor myself. But from my perspective, and the perspective of many people, that was a deeply problematic turn in history. In fact, I've written a lot on the philosopher Peter Singer, and he and I don't agree on life issues at all. But one thing we agree on is that this was a major turning point for how to think about the value of life. And at the heart of it was a concern about resources. And so that's a theme I follow throughout the book. So obviously, from my perspective of what I argue in the book, from this perspective of prenatal justice, we saw a whole class of human beings discarded in part because of resource allocation issues, right? Especially from at least a certain kind of feminist perspective. There was a sense that if we want women to have equal access to resources, including professional resources in the culture compared to men. They need to be able to do this. There were always resource questions surrounding Terri Schiavo and other people in so-called PVS, like should we really be spending money on this vegetable, right? This vegetable, even the language itself is offensive to human dignity in my view. And then it's understated, but I think it's there also in the discussion of Alfie Evans and the National Health Service in the United Kingdom. It eventually became about something else, but I suspect, and I don't have proof of this, but I think I have some evidence to show that there were issues of resource allocation. Should we spend money on this neurologically devastated individual in the NHS's single payer healthcare system? And then obviously we already talked about the resource questions that are presenting themselves with regard to dementia. In fact, one, you mentioned the news this morning, the New York Times daily podcast, which I have to say is, whether you agree with what they say in the podcast or not, is just a fantastic podcast. Had another fantastic podcast this morning on the newly approved Alzheimer's drug, which is going to open this can of worms again. There was already, of course, issues of resource allocation when it comes to nursing homes and nurses, and whether how much we reimburse, how much we pay, that sort of thing. But there's a major resource issue coming down the pike, and the podcast does a great job of highlighting it. This drug is extremely expensive, and the benefit to Alzheimer's patients is not clear. And Medicare is likely going to pay for a lot of it, or most of it even, probably. And so we're going to have another question, like how much resources are we going to put into this population, or are we going to come to a conclusion that, you know what, people who aren't fully rational and self-aware, who aren't productive members of society, they really don't count the same as everyone else, and so we don't need to put the same kind of resources into them that we do others.
Right. Now you mentioned the story, from England. And we just had somebody, participating with a question and a comment just from Canada. And it's maybe a good moment to just mention that the book does very much, it's not just a United States book. Could you maybe just say something for a moment about that piece and the different stories that you draw on?
Yeah, no, the whole story of Alfie Evans, which is the penultimate chapter, is about a little British boy. And the questions about what's happening to patients with dementia is really a live question in Canada right now, given the very, very precipitous slope that Canada finds itself on when it comes to physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia. So I'm U.S. American. I am focused in some ways on that context because it's my context, but the broader context is really one of any culture that has a secularized medical establishment power structure, which says that it's not what we used to think made us all equal or valuable, that we share a nature which reflects the image and likeness of God, but it's something else. It's trait X: rationality, self-awareness, volition, will, whatever. Consumption, production, something other than that. Any culture, and it's largely the consumerist West I'm talking about, but not only, that says it's those things which make you valuable rather than our shared nature as human beings, then this problem is there already in spades.
Yeah. One of the things I can almost sense people as they're listening, is the sense of the issues being almost overwhelming at points. And I think one of the things we really want to communicate, we mentioned this at the beginning in terms of the mission of the book. The book is really also a large section of it is really about how we reverse course. And in that reverse of course, you're really calling, it's not just the experts, that you're calling on. And so could you maybe say a little bit about the sense in which how everyday people can really have a role in participating in this reversing course as we begin to think about this issue?
Yeah, the final chapter in conclusion is really about what do we do? And I start with individuals, actually. There are certain things all of us can do, or most of us can do. as individuals. And that's a big part. And back to the thick Jewish communities that I've been dialoguing with recently on this. One of the things we need to do is make a commitment as individuals, especially after the pandemic or hopefully post-pandemic, is to make a commitment to these kind of thick communities and extended families and neighborhoods and churches, and be there for each other in dramatic and frankly self-sacrificial ways. This is not easy. Ask anybody who takes care. I mean, I hope it's clear this is, to take care of somebody with later stage dementia requires an enormous amount of effort and self-sacrifice. And if you do it by yourself, it's just completely overwhelming. We need as individuals to make commitments to be in community with each other in these ways. It's an essential part of what I'm calling for in the book, and I'm not the first person to call for that by any stretch of the imagination. It has the added effect of being something that so many of us are thirsting for right now, right? This real life embodied kind of connection with others in community is something that so many of us have been denied for the last year and a half or so. And so that's another thing I point out in the book, is this could really be something that post-pandemic really could invigorate communities, right? It could give them something which unites them together. And that's something maybe worth mentioning here, is this is not at all a right or left issue. This is not an issue that tends to be polarizing. I've in fact never seen, from my writing on this stuff in the New York Times to being on Tucker Carlson's show, there isn't a kind of political spectrum here, right versus left, conservative versus liberal. We all kind of get that this is an issue of fundamental importance that we need to address. And so I think this is something that, somebody that voted for Trump and somebody that voted for Biden could unite on and have a kind of unity, something that the Focolare and New City Press are very interested in promoting. This is something we could reach across the aisle and work on together, both in our local communities, in our churches, but also I think with regard to public policy. There's very interesting discussions about whether we can and should, for instance, reimburse via Medicaid and Medicare in-home care of patients and residents with dementia, right, rather than in nursing homes. It actually, if you do the math, it's actually far less expensive to take care of somebody at home. And it's another thing that, again, local families, local churches, local neighborhoods, local communities can kind of get together and work on. So this is by no means for the talking heads or the policymakers necessarily. It's very much about, can we get together as local communities and make a commitment to treat people in these stages as our equals? Yes.
And so I wanted to, we just, a question just came into the box as we're at the end of it. So I want to acknowledge the question. It is a great question. And perhaps Charlie will be able, to follow up with it directly. But I just wanted to acknowledge that question, but I don't think that we're going to be able to dive into it because it really opens up a whole nother dimension of it. But we did just want to do a couple things as we're coming to the end. One is just, again, to come together and just to say, we just want to celebrate this effort by Charlie. Those of you that know him personally know how much he's really worked and been doing a lot of a really original reporting and commitment over the time as this book's been in development. So we wanted to celebrate that. We also just wanted to say, Charlie, this book's been kind of at the printer and at the typesetting for a while. Is there something else that you're up to? You're the busiest man in show business, as we say. What's happening? Anything coming next, just to kind of put on our radar?
Well, I'm sick and tired of being in my own head, so I want to get into the head of others. And with you and others at New City Press, I'm going to be starting a new book series, which we're calling the Magenta Project. And hopefully, if you're on this call, you'll get more information about that. But I'm recruiting authors right now and working with authors right now to be a part of a 5-year plan to try to commit to books from bold Christian voices that similarly reach across the divides. And one of the reasons for calling it the Magenta series is on the color wheel, magenta is halfway in between red and blue. So keep a lookout for that. And if you know anyone that would be interested in maybe perhaps writing for the series, we have maybe the first couple years kind of planned out, but beyond that, we're still kind of looking, and look for that in the future.
Great. Well, thank you everybody for coming on. We do, there's a couple of these questions that we'll make sure that we pass along to Charlie to be able to respond to. And we'll be sending you an email real soon, within the next hour or two, following up with some of the links to the things we talked about. We do just want to finish looking one more time at the book. We want to thank you for coming. We do want to encourage you to order the book early. It'll be really helpful to the launch of the book. And we want to encourage you to be a part of this team. If there's any feedback that you have for us, for Charlie, we really value your participation and your help in helping the launch. We always value any ideas that you might have to helping spread the word. So feel free to respond to that email when you get it later today. But for now, we're going to leave it right at that 40-minute mark. And thank you very much for coming today.
Thank you.
Take care. Thanks, Charlie.